Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Today, we've got a really interesting show. We've got Sarah Shoemaker and Dr. Jacob Muller both on to give some topics that are very interesting.
Yeah, Renee, great to be with you today. So excited about today's show. And we're having Dr. Jacob Muller back, as you mentioned. He's going to be talking about some ways that climate change is impacting our forests here. And then we also have a first-timer, Ms. Sarah Shoemaker with the Kentucky Division of Forestry. She's going to be talking about invasive plant management kind of in this region, but also with a little special focus, I think, on bush honeysuckle as well. So if you're dealing with that, make sure you get ready to ask her some questions if you've got any. But we're really excited to have you all with us today. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule. It's a beautiful day here in Lexington, Kentucky, and we're going to get some good education out for you all. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the chat function. And if you're catching us on YouTube or a podcast listener, hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu, and we can respond that way. But delighted to be here with you tonight.
Yes, it's a wonderful day. So let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Muller, if you'd like to turn your camera on, welcome to the show. We appreciate your being back on with us.
Yes.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm glad you invited me to talk today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, looking forward to your talk.
So I know you had talked a little bit about during the Woodland Owner Short Course about, this topic. And I thought, wow, what an awesome topic that would be for our show. So I kind of, said, hey, can you do this for the show? So I really appreciate you doing that and going ahead and presenting to our guests.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen if I can.
Should be able to.
How does that look?
It's coming. There we go. Great.
We good?
Yes.
Good.
Okay. Let me minimize this. Okay. All right. Well, again, I'm Jacob Muller, an assistant professor of silviculture extension and climate adaptation. And that basically means trying to come up with ways that we can really prepare our forests for the future, understanding that there's going to be all these changes, right? We know that the forests and the climate are very dynamic systems. They're changing. And sometimes that means we need to think about how we manage the forest and how we might adapt to those changes, right? So I thought today I'm going to be covering kind of some ways that climate is changing and how forests are going to respond, or how climate change is going to affect those forests. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Climate is changing, right? We know it's always changing. But when we look at these maps, they're not necessarily real intuitive, right? And we see maps like this that show temperature changes over the past century, and there can create kind of a lot of confusion, right? Some of that has to do with the scale that we're looking at it, the time scale, the geographic scale that we're looking at. But when we look at this map, we see that Kentucky's kind of been included in this, what we're calling a warming hole. So it hasn't really changed on average as much as other parts of the country, especially when you look up in the Northeast and up in Minnesota, where you see those darker reds where there's been a lot more temperature change over the past century. Kentucky hasn't seen quite that level of change, even though it has changed. Kentucky temperatures have risen about a little over 0.5 degree Fahrenheit, less than half the warming of the contiguous United States since about the beginning of the 20th century. But the warmest consecutive 5-year interval was the past 5-year interval, right? Since the 1970s, warming began accelerating everywhere, even across states that were already warming faster. So the speed of warming across the lower 48 states has tripled from about 1/10 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade to almost 0.5 degree Fahrenheit per decade since the 1970s. In fact, all 49 states that were analyzed have warmed by almost 2 degrees since the 1970s, and Kentucky has warmed a little more than that. When we look at extreme temperatures, we also start to see some changes. Right? On the figure on the left, we see the number of days exceeding 90 degrees, and these are projected changes under these different scenarios. Right? In these scenarios, these RCP 8.5 is kind of this higher emission scenario. So that means these models that show that there's going to be more carbon in the atmosphere over the next century. When we look at these higher emission scenarios, we see the potential for significantly more warm days. In fact, in Kentucky, we could see 30 to 40 more days per year over 90 degrees. Similarly, when we look at days below freezing, below 32 degrees, we're going to see fewer days. And that seems perhaps intuitive with a warming climate, but I think it's important to understand that both increasing temperature, but also those lower temperatures having fewer of those below freezing days. And we talk a lot about maple syrup in this part of the country. Not to discourage anyone from maple syrup, because it's a really great opportunity for woodland owners, but it's something that we need to consider, right? When woodland owners rely on that freezing thawing cycle above and below freezing, it's important for us to understand that in the future, some of these things may be affected. When we look at precipitation, increases in precipitation are projected for Kentucky, and most likely that'll occur in the winter and spring. Changes in summer and fall precipitation are less certain, but continuing increases in the frequency and intensity of these extreme precipitation events are also projected, potentially increasing the frequency and intensity of floods. At the same time, the intensity of future droughts is projected to increase because of increases in evapotranspiration rates, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and the potential for increasing both the intensity of floods and droughts will have implications for important sectors of the state's economy, including agriculture, industry, tourism, and certainly natural resource management. This chart shows the observed and projected changes in average temperature over the state of Kentucky, kind of based off of those two emission scenarios. So that green color is the lower emission, this RCP 4.5, and that red is that higher emission scenario. So again, those are those scenarios with higher amounts of carbon in the atmosphere over time. Each of the lines represents kind of a possible pathway based on assumptions about the future greenhouse gas emissions, our social behavior and policy. The bars on the right show the likely ranges in temperature by the end of the century relative to the last few decades average. So we can see that the light blue line represents that, or that green line represents the 4.5. A relatively low amount of change would be driven by significantly reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And that red line represents that higher emission scenario and the highest amount of change that would be driven by steadily increasing amounts of carbon by the end of the century. These two scenarios kind of bracket most of those future emissions outlined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, in their evaluation by these different emission scenarios. These emission scenarios are used by downscale climate models to project climate change at the regional level, the national level, and that includes across Kentucky as well as the United States. But there's a lot of uncertainty ahead. There's a lot of uncertainty in how climate is going to change, and there's a lot of uncertainty in how the forest will respond to that change. And so I'm going to kind of go over 7 ways that there's kind of a general consensus in the way that those changes that I just kind of described and how they're going to impact forests. And we pull a lot of this information from existing resources. There's a couple I'd like to highlight. Important resources that have been developed: the Central Hardwoods Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment and the Central Appalachian Vulnerability Assessment, which kind of cover our area. And these are USDA publications that highlight the vulnerabilities across the forest. We are actually in the currently developing, we've just finished our first draft of the manuscript for a Southern Appalachia Climate Vulnerability Assessment that's going to cover a lot of that area that isn't being covered by these two. And you can kind of see that cutout of Kentucky. That doesn't mean that these vulnerability assessments don't include forests of Kentucky, but these were performed by the northern region of the Forest Service, which Kentucky is in the southern region. And so that's why we're developing these complementary assessments vulnerability assessments right now. Another tool that we use is called the Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas tool. And this allows us to look at projections of tree species across its range and how that might change over time, how its habitat might change. And so these are two really important tools that we use. The number one is longer growing seasons. So the length of the growing season here is defined as the number of days between the last spring freeze and the first autumn freeze. Warmer temperatures in every season has already resulted in a longer growing season in Kentucky, which is about a week longer in 2020 compared to the end or the beginning of the 20th century. At the end of this century, a lot of the models project 3 or 4 more weeks in the growing season here in Kentucky under those lowest climate scenarios, that RCP 4.5, and under those more extreme scenarios, that 8.5 RCP, we could see 6, 7, or 8 more weeks of the growing season, which is a significant change and will have lots of implications. And there's evidence both worldwide and regionally that increases in growing season length during the past century are partly responsible for observed increases in forest growth and forest carbon sequestration. And so as I'm going through these, I think it's important to remember that there are these ways that climate is going to impact the forest. Most of the time, we kind of think about these as having negative impacts on the forest. There are perhaps some opportunities that we also need to think about and try to capitalize as we manage our forests into the future. Growing seasons could mean longer growing seasons, which could promote growth. At the same time, we know that there's going to be more droughty conditions, which could inhibit growth or create other problems. And so there's kind of both of these things that we need to consider as we move forward. Longer growing seasons can result in a false spring. When warmer temperatures cue plants to form early buds and start sap flow through the tree. When this is followed by a cold snap, like a rapid dip in temperature, these newly formed buds and flowers, and even the tree itself, are at increased risk of frost damage. Increased risk of moisture stress. The longer and warmer growing seasons might also lead to an increased risk of moisture stress, especially later in the growing season. It may seem contradictory to expect both an increase in precipitation and an increase in drought, but timing is everything. And changes to the hydrologic cycle in winter and spring can contribute to worsening conditions in the summer and fall. So in the winter and spring, we see earlier peak runoff, but we're also seeing fewer rain events overall, with more rain coming down in these single episodic events. And that's contributing to more storm runoff rather than renewing that soil water. In summer, temperatures are expected to warm even more than winter temperatures, causing more moisture to be lost through evaporation and through transpiration, which we're kind of looking at in these figures here. Warmer temperatures and the variability in precipitation will likely result in greater stress and mortality to trees with sites that are already on drought-prone soils, trees with greater moisture requirements, and sites that are exposed to greater warming, or sites that are currently overstocked, which we have plenty of in this region. Number 3, increased risk of wildfire. The authors of this model and this work used a series of statistically downscaled global climate models, GCMs, in combination with these physical chemistry fire models or frequency fire models to project changing potential fire probabilities for those 2 different scenarios, right? The RCP 4.5 and that RCP 8.5, that higher emissions scenario. And we see under the high emission scenario that the probability of fire is expected to increase in Kentucky by 75 to 100% by the end of this century. Again, this is the probability of fire starting. And I think it's important to note that it's not necessarily the severity of fire, though we do expect that the severity of fire or wildfire will increase in as well as the probability of the fire. CO2 fertilization, and this is kind of an interesting one, but the more CO2 in the atmosphere, right, the more plant food essentially there are for trees. So with longer growing seasons, CO2 fertilization could perhaps be a silver lining. As more carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere, plants are able to increase their photosynthesis and increase their water use efficiency in that process. This diagram shows the stomatal pore of a plant leaf where CO2 enters and water exits. So as more CO2 enters, the opening of that pore gets smaller, reducing the amount of water that is lost through transpiration. Although this would be great in the perfect ideal world where trees would take in more CO2, take in more food, and make more oxygen, and lose less water, there are some limitations that have been identified in the research that's gone on looking at CO2 fertilization. There's evidence that support limited sink strength, meaning that trees will acclimate to the increased growth and more food, more CO2, and that will not necessarily equal more growth after a certain point. Right? They kind of calibrate and they acclimate to that increased CO2, not necessarily resulting in a large growth response or more accumulation of carbon in the wood and more oxygen as a byproduct. Additionally, the ability of trees to capitalize on the increased CO2 varies by species, by site quality, and any potential increase might be offset by, again, those droughty conditions, drought stress, and other disturbances. Number 5, changes in suitable habitat. The capability of a tree species is kind of this new metric that we use that describes the capability of a tree species to cope with climate change. And that's based on the species' current abundance on the landscape, its habitat change class, how that habitat will change over time, and its ability to adapt to those future conditions. When species respond the same way under both climate scenarios, right, the high and the low scenarios, we have more confidence in those future projections. And so those species with good climate change capability in both of those scenarios include some of Kentucky's most common tree species: yellow poplar, sugar maple, white oak, red maple, eastern red cedar, black oak. Unfortunately, there are also important species that are expected to do poorly under these scenarios, right? And some of those are highlighted. This is just based off of those tree atlas projections. And this shouldn't be used necessarily as a direct management tool, but as just another piece of information as we start thinking about how we manage for different tree species into the future, right? Those species that are projected to do well, we call kind of those climate winners, and also those that are expected to do worse, so climate losers. And there's also potential for some new habitat, right? Species that might be migrating in from the north. Across the eastern US, there's evidence that tree species and other organisms may be moving northward and upward in elevation. Evidence also suggests that ranges may be contracting as species retreat to the southern edge of their range, and some species decline. Other species increase and migrate and can expect to see changes in their forest composition. Perhaps even enough change to redefine a forest type and its association on the landscape. Number 6, extreme events. Extreme events such as heavy rain, heat waves, windstorms, floods, and droughts are all projected to become more frequent and severe as a result of climate change. Because they are events that are typically distinct from the long-term average climates, these events are especially hard to model, but are already becoming challenges in land management. And the impacts of extreme events is directly tied to the ability of an ecosystem to tolerate a changing disturbance regime. And number 7, invasive plants. And this is something that certainly Dr. Crocker, who is a frequent guest on this show, can speak to, but I wanted to highlight this because this is an important consideration in the way that climate change may impact our forests. Non-native invasive species are already a major threat to many forests in Kentucky. And I know you're well aware of what we've already got here. Many invasive plants will benefit from climate change due to their broad habitat requirements, earlier leaf out, and more aggressive colonization of new areas. Warmer temperatures and earlier springs are all positive things for invasives, as are increases in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which have positive effects on plant growth. Risks are especially high where invasives are already established and in systems that are already struggling. So it's clear that there are a lot of direct and indirect effects of climate change. And those interactions can be different threats and stressors and shift or amplify ecosystem processes in expected ways, such as drought increasing the susceptibility of tree species and pests or pathogens, as well as unexpected ways that we haven't even anticipated yet. So when we kind of combine all these things, this effect, this multiplier effect, we start to create conditions that we need to consider as forest managers, and we need to consider as landowners as we start thinking about the future of our forests and the ways that climate change will impact our forests. I don't intend for any of these things to be a kind of a fear-mongering topic, but they are important things for us to consider as we look forward. As climate change impacts our forests, different disturbances become perhaps more prevalent or more extreme, or the increasing probabilities, such as in fire or droughts and flooding, and certainly insects and diseases. I think it's important to know that climate change is creating unique challenges amplified by these disturbances and creating conditions that make it difficult to respond to and to adapt to. But as managers, we're creating and developing these tools that we can then use to perhaps take advantage of some of those opportunities and also mitigate or reduce some of the impacts, and also adapt the way that we manage our forests to ensure that we have long, sustainable forests that are providing all of the important functions and values that we maintain on this. So what can we do? We can do all sorts of things. And we're not going to get into what we can do in this talk, but just to kind of highlight a couple of those things, right? Adapting to, so those actions to reduce the vulnerability of the system to climate change, and mitigating, right? And these are actions to reduce the carbon emissions and enhance carbon sinks. And this is more directly related to things that are common topics in our forests today, such as forest carbon markets, and how we can use our forests as these sinks to help us reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and ultimately mitigate some of those impacts that we expect to occur. So with that, I thank you for joining me today. And I think, Renee, I'm not sure if we have take questions now or later, but I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. So if anybody has any questions, please type them in the chat pod and we can get those answered. But you know, it's something that we really that seems to be happening. So we've got to actually learn more about this and what steps we can take to help in this process.
Yes. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Lee. Nice comments there. Appreciate you, Jacob. That was really important stuff. As Renee said, we've got to pay attention to this, and we need to respond accordingly. So working with professionals can go a long way to help you get there.
Yeah, definitely. Yep.
Looks like we don't have any questions. You answered all of them.
But a fantastic job then. Yes.
I put my email there on that last slide. But if you do have questions, I'd be happy to answer any of those. So feel free to reach out.
Right.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Excellent.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Dr. Muller.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
All right. Yeah, no, good. We'll get you back.
Yeah, definitely.
Good deal. Excellent.
So next on our agenda for today, we have Sarah Shoemaker. She is the KDF Frankfurt branch manager, and she's going to be talking about invasive species with bush honeysuckle. You know, we had talked I don't know, a couple of weeks ago about how we were kind of doing this series with KDF and their different regions. And so we have asked her to come on to talk about what's in her region. I think we've had one other one, I think. And then we'll have another one in a couple of weeks. So
It's really great to be able to kind of dive in a little bit what's going on in the different regions of the Kentucky Division of Forestry. So also excited to have Sarah with us. She's a first time guest and yes, and I'm really excited about having Sarah. She's done a lot of great work here in Kentucky for a long time. She's done a lot of great work with the Kentucky Tree Farm Committee as well. So I really appreciate Sarah and looking forward to having her on with us.
Yep. So Sarah, if you want to go ahead and join us and turn your camera on. Welcome.
Hello.
Joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
Fine to
Looking
have you.
forward to our discussion today. As you mentioned, we're kind of just talking about some of the major concerns that we see reoccurring in our branches in specific areas. As stated, I'm in the Frankfurt branch, so we're primarily operating in the inner and outer bluegrass and some of the knobs and Cumberland Plateau as well. I'm just going to share my screen. I did put together a PowerPoint for
Awesome.
today.
Sarah, thanks so much for taking your time out of your schedule to be with us and our guests. We really appreciate you very much and all that the Kentucky Division of Forestry does. You are such a key partner here in the state for sure.
Okay.
Awesome. Looks good.
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, great. So to start out with, just a little bit of a discussion about what we see out in the woods with these infestations. In the photo on the right side, you can see a bit of a younger infestation of bush honeysuckle. These stems are smaller in diameter and they're growing extremely thick, almost like an impenetrable wall of bush honeysuckle, very difficult to walk through. And then on the left side, we're seeing much more mature bush honeysuckle infestation where we can walk through here maybe a little easier because we're under these 20, sometimes 30-foot tall bush honeysuckle shrubs. In these photos, you can see the incredible amount of shade these are putting on our forest floors. And I thought I'd start our talk a little bit about what's happening ecologically when we have this type of an infestation. This is, of course, keeping our native trees from regenerating ourselves. So we don't have baby trees or even wild forbs, flowers, things that are very important for wildlife browse, as well as that regeneration of our forests to keep them healthy and sustainable. This also hurts migratory bird populations by displacing nutritious native berries and drupes with this less nutritional food source for our wildlife. See, there we go. This photo is showing a pre and post bush honeysuckle removal practice. This is a landowner I worked with along the Kentucky River in Fayette County. On the left, you can see that standing bush honeysuckle, very thick, very little growing in the understory underneath of this bush honeysuckle. And then on the right, you can see all that bush honeysuckle cut down, and you're already seeing the amount of light that is now reaching the forest floor. And that's what we're wanting to do. We're wanting to bring light to the forest floor to encourage our native trees, our native wildflowers, and native forbs to grow in these areas. Primarily, the Kentucky Division of Forestry recommends the cut stump method. This requires a follow-up spray the following growing season. I have a little demonstration video here. This is at Flora Cliff Sanctuary in Fayette County, where we are You're not allowed to use power tools here. So we did a handsaw, and then we treated with glyphosate and applied that directly to the stump. A couple of things I like about this practice, you can use hand saws, you can use chainsaws, you could use a brush cutter, so like a weed whacker with a blade attachment. A lot of my landowners really prefer to use that because you're not having to bend over as much. It is important to note that you need to apply the herbicide almost immediately after treatment, because the cells of that stem will start closing up, and you really want that herbicide to be getting into the stem so it can kill the root ball. And this is our prescription for the cut stump method. We really prefer you not start this until May due to high sap flow. It can actually, the water moving through the stem can push the chemical out of that cut stump. So we want you to wait until May and treat through January 31st. The best time is the fall, when those stems are senescing and bringing nutrients and water into the root ball. And then it'll suck the herbicide down into that root ball and give you a really good kill. Anytime is a good time to kill bush honeysuckle, really, except for cut stump method during that early spring season with a lot of sap flow. I generally recommend glyphosate as a concentrate for my landowners. It has a low risk of any type of carryover in the soil for your residual stems. That's the trees and native shrubs that you're trying to retain within the stand. And then with this treatment, you do a foliar application the next growing season on anything that sprouts. So you're just going through, making sure it worked, and foliar spraying anything that does come back. This is by far the most common bush honeysuckle removal method that I work with landowners on. Another option, however, for really bad infestations is mechanical removal of invasive shrubs. And I do have a video link here. We won't be watching the whole video. We're just going to show, I don't know, 20, 40 seconds here.
This bag, we got Orientals on Oriental plants. So let's say we're completely mulching this whole thing to the ground and restart it.
So I wanted to pause it right there. Obviously, this is a very aggressive practice to rid yourself of these types of invasive species infestations, but sometimes it is absolutely the way to go to really start rehabilitating the property towards a native ecosystem. As you can see, your operator will definitely need to be very skilled. You'll want to do this on areas that aren't extreme slopes to avoid soil erosion issues. But you can see where they left this tree and worked hard not to damage it. And you can see in the background where they've already done work, leaving those hardwood trees intact and basically prepping the bed for a full rehabilitation of this area. In the Frankfurt branch, we do see a lot of this, especially on farmland that has gone idle and is reverting back to forest land. It can be very difficult to cut this type of a scenario by hand, and there are several vendors that do this type of work. This type of work is also available through cost share now with NRCS, so that is a really great option for landowners with very extreme cases of infestation. Here you can see our prescription plan for this type of work. You would be using rotary mowers, rotary chippers, or masticators to cut and grind down those invasive species. And then the following growing season, you would do a foliar application of glyphosate. And you would actually do that for 2 growing seasons since we were unable to get herbicide directly on those stumps. You just can't find them after they've been ground down. So we wait for them to sprout and kill them with herbicide for 2 growing seasons. For many of my landowners, as we write these types of prescriptions, a lot of times there will be areas that are of their topography and the stocking of their woods is a really good candidate for this work, but maybe along the slopes we need to do hand cutting, so your forester can help you delineate these areas so you know where to do which type of practice for your property. Another thing is creating achievable goals in this type of labor-intensive work. I'm sharing with you a map of a property along the Kentucky River. They have 20 acres there, and you can see we delineated out 5-acre blocks here so that every year you would do initial cut stub treatment in area A, and then do the next year initial cut stump in area B and follow-up spray in area A. And you just work through those areas in that way, making small achievable goals. I would flag these off for the landowners so they know the areas they are completing, and I always encourage them to celebrate their success. When you look at a large acreage, it can be very daunting, really bad for morale to just look at everything as a whole. So by sectioning off areas and creating achievable goals for yourself, that's how you can really stay vigilant. And it seems like a long time, but you know, in 5 years to have 20 acres of your property bush honeysuckle free is amazing progress. And this is a photo. The video I had of me removing bush honeysuckle at Flora Cliff Nature Sanctuary. This is post-treatment. So this is after the removal of bush honeysuckle. We got all that light hitting the ground and had a flush of native wildflowers. And we will see regeneration of native hardwood trees as well over time as this property continues to heal from its infestation. And that's all I have for now. If anyone has any questions.
Well, great presentation, Sarah. I really appreciate you doing that. And you know, it is amazing to me that the massive amount that in that video that you showed me, I was like, I've seen it, but I've not seen it like that. And that was like, I can imagine that being very overwhelming for a landowner. But then that after picture of things that pop up, I mean, you wouldn't even think that that would be there. And it just shows what is hiding underground and waiting for the opportunity to have new growth.
Absolutely. Our native seed source is there in the seed bank. And if we give it the sunlight and the care that it needs to compete, we can really have a lot of success in reestablishing ecosystems for our wildlife and sustainable forestry efforts.
Sarah, great job. Really, really do appreciate you being on the show. Really liked how you kind of made it in chunks and then celebrating the victories, right? That's so important, right? Because, getting that, keeping your momentum, keeping your energy up for it can be challenging sometimes, but fortunately having professionals like you to lean on and kind of guide the way. So you're not alone, folks. There's people that can help you kind of figure all this out. So if you're struggling with some of this on your own property, and I know a lot of you are, make sure that you're working with KDF or other professionals to get this stuff treated. So Sarah, really wonderful work. There was a question about the wildlife benefits of bush honeysuckle. Are there any? I know at one point we had introduced bush honeysuckle. I guess as a collective had introduced bush honeysuckle as a plant for wildlife species. But and if you had any other kind of thoughts on that.
Obviously they can provide some cover, but actually when the infestations get to the extent that we see in the Frankfurt branch, wildlife don't like to walk through it either. Everything wants that path of least resistance. And if your neighbor has cleared their bush honeysuckle and you haven't, you will see that the wildlife prefers to be somewhere where they can move around a little bit. And yeah, the nutritional value of bush honeysuckle is very poor for our native wildlife in terms of birds, but it's also replacing all of that native browse of our native hardwood trees that they usually would prefer to munch on. So it really reduces browse, and really our native shrubs provide the cover that we're needed. So it really has no positive wildlife
Right.
impact.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's a good reminder for folks. If you've got one or two plants on your property, now's the time to get them out of there, right? Before you have a hillside of them or worse, right? So they will spread rapidly.
I know one time I had one that came up. I had a chain link fence around my property, and it's just a little place in Lexington, and it came up and I cut it. This is before I worked here, so I didn't know anything about it, other than what it was. I cut it down and it didn't do anything. Well, it came right back, and before I even noticed it again, it had like embedded itself within that chain link fence. I literally had to go buy a chainsaw the next time to cut it out, and then I ended up, getting that herbicide on it. But yeah, if I'd have got it all when it was little bitty, I wouldn't have had to went and bought a chainsaw and all that kind of stuff. So lesson learned there.
Learn from Renee, yes. Oh, let's see.
We do have another question coming in. If Billy, if you want to.
Yeah, so as someone brand new to identifying invasive species, in order to identify where the bush honeysuckle is and how big an issue it is, would we consult with our local county UK Extension Office? You certainly could. If they're going to be able to help you certainly identify those species if you're unable to do so and get you kind of pointed in the right direction. But if you're going to be kind of trying to tackle this on your own, then especially, if you've got any more than a yard, reach out to the Kentucky Division of Forestry or some other local, professionals that will be able to kind of walk you through that process. But yes, you can get some support at the local county extension office. I will say typically the worst of the bush honeysuckle infestation, and Sarah, correct me if you know better, but it's basically here in the central part of the state up through the north of the state. That's kind of the worst. We are seeing it though. I've seen it in Letcher County. I've seen it at Robinson Forest. So it's getting out there and it's spreading further, but really kind of in this core central bluegrass, inner outer bluegrass area is kind of where it's the worst that I've seen at least.
Yeah, and if you need any like ID videos or anything like that, you can just go to fromthewoodstoday.com and you could look up Dr. Ellen Crocker has done several on bush honeysuckle. And so you could be able to watch that for identification and that kind of thing. Also, if you just go to ukforestry.org, which is our website, and just do a search for bush honeysuckle under forest health, you'll be able to find some information there as well.
And I'm going to drop that link in for everybody here.
Terrible on the sides of Mountain Parkway. Yep. You're correct.
Oh yeah, and getting worse, right? It really is, and I mean, it's not the only one that's out there causing some problems, but it is a bad one, that's for sure.
Well, Sarah, thank you for being a first timer on Billy just loves our first timers. He
I'm trying to expand our audience and our family, right? So
Exactly. And thank you. And if you have any, thing that pops up in your region and you need to let our woodland owners know about it, please let me know and I'll be happy to have you on the show again.
Yes.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Keep up the great works there, and thanks to you and all of the folks at the Kentucky Division of Forestry for the great
Yeah.
work you do. We appreciate it very much.
Okay, great.
Good deal.
Yeah.
All right.
So,
All right.
show.
It was a really good show. Yep. Really
Yes.
pleased with our guests and then
Mhm.
our speakers. They did such a nice job. Thanks to Dr. Muller for going over some of the ways that climate change is impacting our forests. And certainly appreciate Sarah Shoemaker talking about kind of invasive species, specifically bush honeysuckle here in central Kentucky. So good program. Always good to be with you, Renee.
Yes, definitely. And, we had mentioned it earlier, but if you do go to fromthewoodstoday.com, you can see every show we've ever done, including several forest health, if it's bush honeysuckle to, whatever. I mean, Ellen has a lot of different things on there. So, there might be some invasives that you're like, I don't know what that is, but if you don't, there is a little survey at fromthewoodstoday.com.
That's right. Take a picture of something you might see, or let us know something you'd like to learn about, and we'll try to help you via that little survey too.
Yep, definitely. So, that's what we're here for. Try to help you with your woodland owner needs. And we can, if you see a picture, you never know. You send us a picture, rather, someone else might be going, I don't know what that is either. I need help with that. So we've done it several shows before about it.
Yeah. So again, I've said it before, and Renee, you just said it, but if you all have a question about something in your woods, you're not sure how to handle it or what to do or something new, there's probably somebody else out there that's going through that same thing, and we can help them as well. So help us help everybody else by letting us know what's challenging you.
Exactly. So we really appreciate you joining us, and we will see you next week. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
From the woods today. From the woods today.